Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. Welcome to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. It's a pleasure and an honor having all of you here. My name is Mehran Kamrava, and I'm the head of the Iranian Studies Unit here at the Arab Center, and I'm also a professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. It's a pleasure welcoming all of you here to this conference. A year ago this time, Iranians went to the polls and elected a new president. For 8 years, we had President Hassan Rouhani. And Rouhani's presidency brought with it lots of promise. In fact, in the first term of Rouhani, we had the signing of the nuclear accord. As we all know, that nuclear accord was not to be. In 2018, the United States pulled out. Now we're a year into the Raisi presidency, and we all thought it would be a good time to pause and reflect on Iran's domestic politics and its foreign policy over the course of the year that has passed. As we all know, Iran and the world powers are negotiating right now in Vienna, and as we speak, in fact, we're waiting to hear back from the United States on its response to Iran's proposal for the nuclear accord. Iran has given its proposal, and we're waiting to hear back from the United States. This will no doubt be a topic of great discussion over the next 2 days. In fact, over these 2 days, we will be looking both at Iran's foreign policy as well as its domestic politics. My sincere hope is that by the end of tomorrow, we will have a lot more questions than we have answers. But hopefully, we will be able to ask more incisive and informed questions by the end of tomorrow. And hopefully, our speakers, our distinguished panels, will allow us to think through some of these questions that have been vexing for us in terms of domestic politics and Iran's foreign policy. Over the next 2 days, the topics that we will be discussing in Iran's domestic politics will include the very fact that Ebrahim Raisi was elected. This was an election, admittedly like every other election in Iran, that had tremendous importance because in the history of the Islamic Republic, this particular election had the lowest turnout. And of those people who did vote, the second highest percentage of voters turned in blank votes. So the question is, what does this election portend for Iran's domestic politics? And this will be a question that we will be asking. The third largest number of votes in the election after voting for Raisi and blank votes went for the reformist candidate, Hemmati. And so one of the questions we will be asking is the future of Iran's reformist camp. What does this mean for the reformists? Do they indeed belong to the dustbin of history, or do they remain a relevant political force in Iranian politics in the years to come? We will also explore the question of whether Iran's hybrid authoritarian political system is tilting more and more towards authoritarianism and indeed stopping to be hybrid. Do elections matter in Iran? And what do elections mean in terms of state resilience and the meaningful nexus between people and the political leadership? One of the questions that we'll also be exploring is the cyber politics, the cyber police that is in Iran, and also the very question of whether Ebrahim Raisi is indeed conservative, as the media would have us believe and as is common knowledge or we commonly presume, or is he far more pragmatic as compared to being reformist? Of course, no discussion of Iranian domestic politics is complete without exploring its economy. And we will spend some time looking at the economy and much more specifically at the question of sanctions. In terms of Iran's foreign policy, we will focus on 4 specific areas, beginning first and foremost with Iran's relations with its neighbors, specifically the GCC states, and looking at the militarization of Iran's perception of Saudi Arabia over the last several years. This, as you can imagine, is one of the most critical relationships in the region, Iran-Saudi relations. We will also look, of course, at the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and what does this mean in terms of Iran's longer-term relationship with the United States? Are these two powers destined to be adversaries, or will we see a return to some sort of peaceful coexistence, some sort of détente between Iran and the United States? And much more specifically, we will explore the question of Israel and Iran's nuclear program, which remains, of course, a critical factor in Iran's relationship with the United States. Much of Iran's relationship with the United States and its relationship with Israel is intertwined, and it is difficult to decouple these relationships from one another. Last but by no means least, we will also explore Iran's relationship with the Caucasus. As you know, there was a devastating war in the Nagorno-Karabakh region between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Iran had to play a very delicate diplomatic role in relation to the Shia majority Azerbaijan and the overwhelmingly Christian Armenia, with whom Iran has much better relations than with Azerbaijan. And so one of the larger questions that I hope we can explore at that time is the extent to which Iranian foreign policy is identity-driven as compared to strategically driven. Is it strategy that dictates Iranian foreign policy in Tehran, or is it indeed identity and sectarian sensibilities? So over the next 2 days, we will be exploring a wide range of issues, and we've been extremely fortunate to have with us a whole array of experts on each of these topics that I very quickly mentioned here. Probably the question that is on the forefront of all of us, on the minds of all of us, and the question that in many ways dictates everything else that I outlined, Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia, for example, the broader nature of Iran's relationship with not just the European Union, but with each of the GCC states. Iran's trade with Qatar, in fact, is even influenced. All of these hinge on the outcome of the negotiations that are currently underway in Vienna. And to help us explore, we have been extremely fortunate to have with us probably the world's foremost expert on Iran-United States negotiations, someone who's been deeply and intimately involved in the history of these negotiations. So allow me to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, Dr. Seyed Hossein Mousavian. And in the interest of full disclosure, I have to say that he's also a good friend of mine. And that is a source of honor and a pleasure. Dr. Mousavian has a PhD from Kent University in England and is currently a Middle East security and nuclear policy specialist at Princeton University in the United States. Princeton University's School of Public Policy and International Affairs. He's a former seasoned diplomat who has served in a variety of diplomatic posts in Iran. From 1990 to 1997, he was Iran's ambassador to Germany. He was head of the Foreign Relations Committee of the National Security Council in Iran. The Supreme National Security Council makes an overwhelming majority of foreign and security policies in Iran. Dr. Mousavian was the head of the nuclear negotiations with the International Committee. You might remember him from 2003 to 2005, when he was the head of the Iranian negotiating team, the foreign policy advisor to Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council from 2005 to 2007, Vice President of the Center for Strategic Research and International Affairs from 2005 to 2009, General Director of the Foreign Ministry for Western Europe from 1987 to 1990, and will be here for the remainder of the conference if I were going to outline all of his accomplishments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mousavian.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, the Iranian Studies Unit, Dr. Kamrava, and all of his colleagues. Definitely, this is a great pleasure for me to be here today with you. Based on what Dr. Kamrava gave me an agenda, I'm supposed to talk about the foreign policy of President Raisi 1 year in office. As you know, according to the Iranian constitution, the supreme leader is the ultimate decision maker on foreign policy. This is based on the constitution. In Iran's political system, the Supreme National Security Council determines the national security policies of the country within the framework of general guidance of Supreme Leader. As the head of National Security Council, the President practically coordinates the directives of the leader in foreign policy. Any decision by National Security Council ultimately should receive the approval of the Supreme Leader. It's important to understand, while we have different presidents, the Supreme Leader during the last 32 years has been the same person and the ultimate decision maker on foreign policy. Ayatollah Khamenei has been the longest serving head of a state and political leader in the Middle East. However, during 32 years of leadership, part of his foreign policy, not all, part of his foreign policy has been challenged by either the administrations and or parliaments. Former President Rafsanjani, Khatami, Rouhani, each served 8 years in office with different and quite distinct on foreign policy. Even Ahmadinejad, in his second term, had a drastic change in the direction of foreign policy, and he opposed not only foreign policy at the end these days with the whole system. With presidential election 2021, a new turning point occurred. The principalists, or conservatives, as we say, usul-gerayan, they won the parliamentary election 2020 and the presidential election 2021. Since President Raisi in office August 2021, governance in Iran has become unified, and the administration, parliament, judiciary, security, and military forces are all loyal to the Supreme Leader's ideas and preferences in foreign policy and domestic policies. I would discuss and review with you today the three key elements of foreign policy during President Raisi 1 year in office. The first one is about the regional policy. Improving relations with neighboring and regional countries seems to me constitutes President Raisi's #1 in foreign policy. This is his priority #1. In the Persian Gulf, Raisi administration has pursued the Hormoz initiative launched by President Rouhani in 2019. However, at the same time, he has pushed ahead for détente in bilateral relation with the regional countries, especially the Persian Gulf countries. Direct talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia started in April 2021 and continued with the same negotiation team by President Raisi. The last round, the fifth round, was in April 2022 with positive outcome, and a lot of people, they think they are very close to reestablish the diplomatic relations. To me, I think Saudi Arabia is waiting for the result of nuclear deal. The moment they agree the nuclear deal, I believe diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia will start. Nevertheless, on the Persian Gulf issue, I think President Raisi would have major challenges. The first one is about Abraham Accord. Some of the GCC countries, they have established relations with Israel within the framework of Abraham Accord. I believe this is not a red line for President Raisi if some GCC countries, they want to have diplomatic relations with Israel, but Iran is not going to tolerate security and military cooperation between any GCC countries with Israel. Because Iranians, they consider Israeli presence in the Persian Gulf as a direct threat to national security of Iran. It's not confidential. Iran and Israel, they are at the status quo of security warfare. Even during President Raisi, there has been clashes between Iran and Israel. The second issue for President Raisi on the Persian Gulf issue would be the scope of cooperation. I believe Iran would be ready to show flexibility on some of the issues GCC countries they expect. If the agenda is broad cooperation, a comprehensive cooperation between Iran and GCC, but not piecemeal approach like maritime security. The third is about the axis of resistance. Iran is willing to advance friendly relations with all neighboring countries and in parallel to continue the support for axis of resistance, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Al-Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, Houthis movement in Yemen. Here there may be a problem because some of the GCC countries, they are in confrontation with the axis of resistance. And the fourth issue for President Raisi would be Iran-US hostilities. The GCC countries, they all have a strategic and broad relations with the US, while Tehran and Washington are in high level of animosities and hostilities. Even if a regional system of cooperation were to be established in the Persian Gulf, GCC countries would want the US president in the region, while Iran's core strategy is for the US to leave the region. On the regional policy of President Raisi, he has also a broader agenda for regional policy. Mainly, he has focused on the two international and regional important organizations. The first one, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. 8 countries are the member: China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. And the second one is BRICS, the countries member of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Raisi has also focused on expanding relations with Central Asia. As of July 2022, he traveled to Russia, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Raisi's first trip was to Tajikistan in order to attend in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The second issue he has been working during last year, or 1 year in office, is about the Iranian nuclear deal. The Iranian nuclear policy is the purview of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. However, President Raisi administration has pursued the revival of the deal agreed between Iran and the world powers in July 2015, known as JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. When Trump withdrew from the deal, Iran started to lower its commitments to JCPOA. When Biden took in office in January 2021, the negotiations between Iran and the world powers started in April 2022. However, because of the Iranian presidential election in June 2021, we had a pause. The new nuclear team started negotiation with the P5+1 in November 2022. And as Professor Kamrava said, the final proposal of P5+1 has been submitted to Iran, and Iranian response just some days ago. And as I understand, 90–95% they are done. There is a little bit more, maybe 5–10%. And Tehran is waiting, and the P5+1, they are all waiting for Washington. However, President Raisi, during a year on nuclear deal, they have had 6 major issues, which we need to see whether the final deal would cover these issues or part of these issues or not. The first one is about the verification. In February 2021, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei set out a clear condition. He said, if they want Iran to return to nuclear deal, US must lift all sanctions. We will verify, and if it's done properly, we will return to our commitments. The issue number 2 has been and is about the guarantees. Iran has been asking 4 types of guarantees. And all is because the US cheating in May 2018 when Trump withdrew from the deal. The first guarantee, Iran has been asking a credible assurances that the next US administration will not again withdraw from the deal. I think Biden cannot make this commitment. And I'm afraid there would not be such a commitment in the deal that the next US president should be committed not to withdraw. However, Biden may give some guarantees about his own term that he would definitely be committed to the deal. The second guarantee is that Iran would be able to use full economic benefits of JCPOA, at least during Biden administration. Here again, I'm afraid that would be complicated because a Congress with majority of Democrats, an administration by Biden, led by Biden, which is going to revive the nuclear deal. During a year and a half, they have imposed a lot of new sanctions on Iran, on the top of 1,500 Trump sanctions. Even if the deal is revived, I'm afraid the US administration and the Congress, they may continue to impose new sanctions on the guise of terrorism, missile, human rights, and regional issues. Such sanctions definitely would dysfunction the Iranian benefits from the full economic benefits of Iran, not all completely, but part of it. The third guarantee has been about other countries willing to have economic relations with Iran. Iran has been asking that the US should not impose the US extraterritorial sanctions. Here again, I'm afraid Biden would not be able to give such a guarantee about the next administration, but he may find some solution about his own term. And finally, the fourth guarantee is that if a future US administration withdraws from the deal, it will, as they have said, it will have to pay the price, or a price. It's not clear yet that they mean the U.S. should pay compensation or other some type of prices. The third issue for President Raisi on the nuclear negotiations has been the safeguard issues. Iran has insisted that the nuclear deal can only be salvaged if the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, drops its claims about Tehran's nuclear program. In June 2021, US and EU, they proposed a resolution to the Board of Governors, which was passed, and they criticized Iran for failing to explain uranium traces found at 3 undeclared sites. Issue number 4 has been delisting Revolutionary Guard from FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization, by the US. Biden rejected, and recently the Iranian side announced they have dropped the demand. Nevertheless, they are interested to continue negotiations on lifting the sanctions and removing IRGC from FTO after the deal is revived. Fifth is about sustainability. They have been asking for a sustainable JCPOA. The current polls suggest that Republicans may win the Congress and even the presidential election. And Republicans also, they have made it clear that they will disregard any nuclear deal if Biden agrees to revive. According to JCPOA, Iran should enrich maximum to the 5% level and to have maximum 300 kilograms of stockpiles. When Trump withdrew from the deal and imposed the most draconian sanctions on Iran, costed hundreds of billions of cost on Iran. In return, Iranian increased the level and capacity of their nuclear program. Today, Iran has 3,500 kilograms of enriched uranium, from 5% to 60%, enabling Iran to make at least one nuclear bomb. If the deal is revived, Iran has to lose all these assets and come back to 300 kilograms. Therefore, to be realistic, every milligram of this enriched uranium have costed Iran tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And if they are going to lose it within 6 months after revival of the nuclear deal, and if the US is going again to cheat, the loser would be Iran. That's why they are insisting on a sustainable deal. And number 6 is abolishment of all sanctions. In a letter to President Raisi, the Iranian lawmakers said, a return to deal should only go ahead if all sanctions were lifted, including those pertaining to terrorism, missile, human rights, technology, which I don't believe that would happen. Nevertheless, I think we have to wait maybe a week or two to see what would be the US response, and hopefully there would be a deal. But I should reiterate that with the rise of energy prices, heightened tension between the West and the axis of China and Russia made the restoration of nuclear deal for President Raisi administration as less urgent than his predecessor, Rouhani. The third issue is about the pivot twist. Up to here, I believe the foreign policy of President Raisi has been similar, continuation of the foreign policy of Dr. Rouhani on the regional issues and on the nuclear deal. To my opinion, the most important development of foreign relations under President Raisi will be the institutionalization of the pivot twist. which is going to happen soon. We should not forget that the US sanctioned President Raisi in 2019, and 5 of his ministers are already under US sanctions. Every Iranian president in the past, they have tried for a balanced relation between East and West, Eastern powers and Western powers. They all have failed because of 4 factors. One is the US hostile policies against Iran. Because of these, Iranians, they have never been able to have a balanced relation with the West. Second, the Israeli acts of sabotage. Third, some of the neighboring countries, they have pushing the US to sanction, to pressure, and even to attack Iran. And worse, they have created an alliance with Israel to confront Iran. And last but not least, the political factions inside Iran opposing rapprochement between Iran and the West. The reality is that these 4 factors brought Iran, China, Russia closer together. All 3 countries are looking for a new world order in the future to end worldwide US hegemony. After Trump withdrew from the deal, Ayatollah Khamenei said, despite their promises, the Europeans have practically adhered to American sanctions and have not taken any action and are unlikely to do anything for the Islamic Republic in the future. So one should give up all hopes on Europeans. There should be no trust in countries that have held the banner of hostility to Iran, led by the US and some European countries, because they are openly hostile to the Iranian nation, Iranian people. No trust to US, no trust to Europe, to my understanding, is the coffin nails to normal relation between Iran and the West. That's why when President Raisi came to office, he said he would not seek for negotiating or expanding relation with the West. He would focus on expanding relation with Russia and China. During the last 3 decades, I personally have advocated good relation with the regional countries, a regional cooperation system with the GCC and Iraq in the Persian Gulf, and a balanced relation between Iran and the West. Still, I have the same theory. Nevertheless, I give you 12 reasons to understand why the Supreme Leader of Iran has decided to leave the West and go to East, pivot to East. Just to understand the narrative and the understanding of the Iranian side on the policy of pivot to East. Number 1, Russia and China have not opposed the Iranian nuclear program, and they do not have any problem if Iran is going to have nuclear capability as a deterrence against potential US or Israeli attack. The West has done its best to deprive Iran under NPT to enjoy peaceful nuclear technology, and they are doing everything to remove Iranian nuclear capability as a deterrence. The second, Russia and China agree and cooperate with Iran on conventional arms and defensive capabilities such as missile and drones. But the US and Europeans have always opposed Iranian defense capabilities through sanctions and sabotages, trying to keep Iran vulnerable to any military strike, because the US still has kept all military options on the table. 3, Russia and China have never sought to disintegrate Iran. I'm talking about after revolution. I'm not talking about before revolution. Every 12 reason I'm giving is about after revolution. Russia and China have never sought to disintegrate Iran, but the US and some of the regional allies, they have done everything to disintegrate Iran whenever they could, like Iraqi invasion of Iran. Fourth, Russia and China have not sanctioned Iran, but the US and Europe have sanctioned Iran for more than 40 years, sanctioned hundreds of Iranian officials, blocked tens of millions of Iranian assets and monies. Five, Russia and China have already exercised the veto right at the UN Security Council for Iran's benefit, while the US and Europe have always regularly exercised their veto right in favor of Israel against Palestinians. Six, Russia and China do not have a global campaign of propaganda and satellite network against Iran, but Western media propaganda in the US and Europe is integrated against Iran with many satellite networks supported by the opposition and terrorist groups. Seven, Russia and China are serious about fighting terrorism like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But the US and the West are using them as instrument, and they have clearly double standard. They cooperated with ISIS and the terrorist groups in Syria to bring regime change in Syria. They have been cooperating with MEK. They have the blood of 17,000 innocent Iranians in their hand. 8, Russia and China, like Iran, they are looking for a multilateralism as a new world order, while the US is focused on unilateralism. 9, Russia and China seek a balanced relation between the regional powers. But to Iranian understanding, the US strategy is based on Israeli domination over the entire Middle East. 10, Russia and China oppose the policy of regime change in Iran, while the cornerstone of US policy after revolution has been regime change in Iran. And finally, China and Russia do not have double standards on human rights, democracy, and freedom, but the West's practical policy is to use human rights and democracy as an instrument against those countries not in the court of the US. The West has supported dictators like Shah of Iran, like Mubarak of Egypt, and they have given carte blanche to Israel on all crimes against Palestinians over past decades. 12, this is the final one. Western culture hegemony is a very important issue, especially for the supreme leader of Iran. He believes that the West is trying to impose cultural imperialism. That's cultural domination of the Western world over Muslim societies to destroy Islamic values. Although communist ideology is equal undesirable, definitely also for Iran, but Tehran is convinced that China and Russia have practically abandoned communism ideology and are not an ideology danger for Iran and Islam anymore. In perhaps the most significant change, Iran has accelerated the expansion of ties with Russia despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has led to extensive Western sanctions on Russia. Raisi met Putin 3 times in the first 7 months of 2022 alone. When Putin visited Tehran, the Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei told him that if you had not taken the helm, the other side, NATO, would have done so and initiated a war. Russia also has shown an interest in purchasing Iranian drones, according to White House. On energy, while both are competitors, but they have cooperated in order to keep the high price in the framework of OPEC+. Where would be the problem for President Raisi? out of the experiences we have experienced during last year. Pivot to East and resistance economy is dual-track policy of President Raisi. He has tried to advance Supreme Leader's concept of resistance economy in the face of US-led sanctions and international isolation. Raisi is not as keen on bolstering economic ties with the West compared to Rouhani. He has pledged not to tie the economy to JCPOA or the will of foreigners, as he said. Due to Ukraine war, the increase of oil and gas prices, Iran has managed to increase oil sale to China and other countries. Even though Iran sells oil at a discount, it has benefited from high global price in 2022. On July 26, the economy minister said the revenue from oil and condensate export was 580% higher from March to July 22 compared to 2021. President Raisi promised to tackle corruption and reduce inflation. A year later, despite of increase in oil price, no fair observer would claim that there is any less corruption or less inflation in Iran. In May, June 2022, food prices were up more than 80% compared to the same period in 2021. According to official figures, this is the 80% increase. Raisi set a target of 8% economic growth for the Iranian year beginning March 2022. But the IMF, International Monetary Fund, they have projected only 3%. To my understanding, minimum requirement for the success of President Raisi's policy of pivot to East and resistance economy are three. One, reviving of JCPOA. Second, rapprochement and good relation with the regional countries. And third, effective policies and decisions to fight internal corruption. Success on these issues would decrease tension with the US and the West. Otherwise, resolving economic crisis with the ocean of sanctions, confronting the US, confronting the West, confronting some regional powerhouses like Saudi Arabia, coupled with the domestic corruption, I believe would not bring a success to what President Raisi really wants to do. The US economy is a behemoth with GDP of $23 billion, while Iranian GDP is $250 million. Many countries would not, they are not going to lose they trade with the US because with such a great economy because of Iran. At the end, I would like to point out an important fact about foreign policy during President Raisi, and that is the fact that during his term, important foreign policy decisions would not be faced with extraordinary internal challenges, because the main decision-making elements of the government are in line with the ideas of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. I remember in any international conferences, whenever I was talking to my GCC friends from Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Emirate for a good relation between Iran and GCC, they were telling me, Mr. Rouhani and Zarif, they don't have any authority. The real authority is Supreme Leader and Revolutionary Guard. Even if it was true, I believe during President Raisi, no one would claim something like this. And that's why I believe this is really a golden opportunity. Now, if they want to engage with President Raisi and Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian, they don't have the same concern if Rouhani or Zarif, they did not have authority. Iran has proposed Hormoz initiative. To be fair, during Rouhani and Raisi, Qatar and Oman, they really played a constructive role to de-escalate tensions between Iran and the West, Iran and the region, and to advance the JCPOA. Iranian proposal of Hormoz peace initiative is the most comprehensive package for improving the bilateral relations between Iran and neighboring countries around the Persian Gulf. The proposal contains a plan of action to achieve a broad spectrum of security and cooperation issues, including energy security, arms control, confidence-building measures, military contacts, establishment of possible weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, and non-aggression pact. The initiative seeks to establish a joint task force on various issues regarding practical measures to gradually expand cooperations, including in early warning, prevention and resolution of conflict, combating drugs and human trafficking, joint investment and ventures in energy, transit and transportation, cooperation in cyber energy. This proposal is based, the principle of the proposal is based on a good neighborly relationship, mutual respect, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and invariability of international borders, peaceful settlements of all disputes, rejection of threats or use of the force, non-aggression and non-intervention in internal and external affairs of each other, and rejection and non-participation in coalition and alliances against each other. In my book published in 2020, titled as A New Structure for Security, Peace and Cooperation in the Persian Gulf, I have explained in great details what the Hormoz initiative really entails. In addition, I have introduced a roadmap to embrace an effective cooperation system in the Persian Gulf. The fact is that it is not possible and would not be possible to have a sustainable security, peace, and stability in the Persian Gulf without Iran. To me, it is high time to end 40 years of tension and hostilities, to seek friendly relations between Iran and Arab, especially Iran and the GCC countries, and definitely this is a golden opportunity for the world powers to revive the JCPOA and to do everything to make a sustainable JCPOA. Because if the next US president is going to withdraw and to cheat again, I'm afraid Iran would never come back to the deal. And the word, if they are going to use their authority to refer the Iranian file to United Nations Security Council, Iran also would withdraw from NPT. That's why everyone should be aware of such a critical moment we are in order to use the time to revive the JCPOA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Seyed Hossein Mousavian, for that very comprehensive discussion. Really appreciate it. I ran out of paper to take notes. I took so many notes. So thank you. Dr. Mousavian has kindly agreed to answer some questions. If you have questions, my colleagues can pass you a microphone. Yes, sir. We'll start. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions. Go ahead, Professor Bakhkat. If you can.
Any microphone there?
Yeah. Professor Bakhkat has flown here from the United States. He'll wait for 1 minute while. Yes.
Thank you. Two quick questions. You mentioned that Iran will not tolerate military cooperation between Israel and Abraham Accord countries. Based on open sources, can you explain what options Iran has? And second question, in the last few days, senior Iranian officials said Iran has the capability to make nuclear weapons if it chooses to. So far, there has not been American Western response. Does it mean they do not believe it or downplaying it, or what do you read the lack of Western response to Iranian declaration? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me, if you don't mind, Dr. Mousavian, I'll take a couple more. Yes, sir. The gentleman, yes.
Well, thank you very much for this really informative narrative of the Iranians' foreign policy, and I would like to just comment on one of the...
If you would contain your, just ask a question, and then if there's time for commentary, we'll have that later.
What is the plan B that the Iranians have been talking about if the deal fails in probably 10 years to come? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in front of you, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent explanations. I just want to ask, how do you see this long and very deep dependency of Iran on Russia and China? Don't you think that this kind of strategic dependency on these two countries does not look very equal and reciprocal? And especially in the time when these these Gulf countries are also going to have very good relations with China and Russia. So how you are going to compensate the friendship which they are going to have with these two countries?
Thank you. We'll just take one last question. If you pass to behind you, yeah, Professor Farehad.
Thank you, Professor Mousavian. It's good to see you here. Good talk. Thank you. Two quick questions. One is, how is the decision-making process in Iran changed from Rouhani to Raisi? Whether there has been any changes in the decision-making process. And the second question that everyone is asking here in the region is about the impact of the signing of the deal, the nuclear deal in Vienna talks. What impact on Iran's foreign policy in the region? Are we going to see something similar to 2015, which led to escalation of conflicts in the region, or are we expecting to see a different result this time? Thank you.
Thank you. I know there are more questions. After Dr. Mousavian answers, we'll come back to taking a second round of questions. If you could turn on. Yeah.
Yes. Iranian nuclear capability, if we want to be transparent, what President Trump did, although imposed sanctions, hundreds of billions of dollars of damages to Iran, but he made Iran a nuclear threshold state. Whether we like it or not, today Iran is a nuclear threshold state. They can make nuclear bomb if they want. That's why at the end of my talks, I said it's very important to revive the nuclear deal and to make it sustainable, because the second cheat may lead Iran to a nuclear state. Iranian military cooperation, you asked about regional states with Israel, what is Iranian option? With Hormoz initiative, Iran has practically officially at the highest level proposed an option of military security cooperation between 8 countries around the Persian Gulf to maintain security and stability of the Persian Gulf and gradual departure of foreign troops. This is the Iranian option. This is the Iranian proposal. The third question was about Plan B. Iran has never talked about Plan B. And I believe they do not want to discuss Plan B. Either JCPOA as is, with clean implementation, or Iran would remain, or we would put JCPOA away, but Iran would remain as member of NPT. Iran would even be ready to, definitely would implement the safeguard agreement. And even I believe Iran would be ready to show goodwill to implement additional protocol in order to show the highest level of transparency measures, even in the absence of JCPOA. But if they are going to take the Iranian file to United Nations Security Council, then here I'm afraid Iran would suspend NPT. And then we would go to a real confrontation. Dependency on Russia and China, I don't believe Iran is looking for dependency. It is not the idea of the supreme leader to be dependent on Russia and China. The idea is resistance economy means self-sufficiency, means independence. However, since they have tried for 40 years rapprochement with the West, every administration, from Rafsanjani hostages in Lebanon 1988 to Khatami cooperation on Afghanistan in 2001 to Rouhani JCPOA. They all have failed. That's why I believe the Iranian supreme leader is fed up with the breaking promises by the West, and they are going to make a strengthening relation not only with Russia and China, with India, with Asia, with the region. It is a matter of a regional relationship. Change in decision-making, legally there is no change in decision-making process in Iran. Everything is the same. But as I said, since Raisi in office and since the principalists, Sulgerayan, they won the parliament and the presidential election, and the system is unified, there is less challenge. Everyone, I don't know if you remember when Rouhani was going to sign the JCPOA, we had huge internal challenges, unbelievably, threatening the foreign minister to death, the head of Atomic Energy Agency to execution, everything. But now, Raisi and Abdullahian, if they want to revive it, there is no such a domestic challenges. Therefore, legally, there is no change. Everything is the same. And I believe Iranian supreme leader position has remained the same. To be very frank, since 2003, when I was member of nuclear team, he had the same concept. Iran to have full right under NPT, highest level of transparency, every objective guarantees that Iran would not possess nuclear bomb, but Iran should not be discriminated under NPT compared to any other country. This was Iranian proposal. We made it to EU3 in 2005. It is already published. If you look at the elements of the proposal during President Khatami, is definitely the same of the principles Ahmadinejad negotiated, and is definitely the same principles of JCPOA. And about the impact of JCPOA to the relation with the regional countries. To be very frank, I would not blame Iranians. WikiLeaks, you remember Rouhani visited Saudi Arabia, they had security accord. And then we have tons of WikiLeaks of documents showing that Saudi Arabia, Emirate, Bahrain pushed the US to attack Iran 2002, 2003, 2005, 2010, 2012. Even during negotiations, Kerry publicly said in every meeting in Saudi Arabia or Israel or Egypt, they were telling us, don't deal with Iran, just attack Iran. If this is the notion, therefore what you can expect from the Iranian side, friendship is not a response to hostility. If they want the US to attack Iran, Iranians would not be ready to go to bed with Saudi Arabia. Therefore, it is the region should change the policy. If they welcome JCPOA, JCPOA means no nuclear bomb in Iran. They can have a regional JCPOA immediately. They can regionalize the principles of JCPOA. They can have nuclear weapon-free zone in the Persian Gulf. They can have WMD-free zone in the Persian Gulf. And they can have every cooperation, whether this is politically, economically, security, military. That's why I believe it can have a great impact, but we need a change in GCC approach, like what at the moment practically Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, they all want to have a good relation. They are waiting for Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is following Saudi Arabia. Emirate, I think, is eager to have a good relation also. Everything dependent to Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. There's a question here on the third row, on the side. Sorry, if I called on this.
I may just ask a quick question. Thank you very much,
Question.
Professor. Thank you very much for the lecture. Very interesting. I'm a faculty here at the Doha Institute. My name is Laurent Lambert. So I'm from France, and I understand that you may have been disappointed by the EU foreign diplomacy, but we have seen in recent years an issue of binationals, Iranian Europeans, such as Iranian French, including scholars, who, when they were going to Iran, have been arrested and for some remain under arrest in Iran as part of the negotiations. Do you believe sustainable agreements can be built on these kind of measures? Fariba Adelkha is in the Evin province, and this is an issue which is raised between European countries and Iran every now and then. So I would be happy if you could shed some light, because I believe this is counterproductive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, sir.
السلام عليكم. أنا سأتحدث باللغة العربية. أريد
لحظة أستاذ. The gentleman has talked about the Hormoz peace initiative. I would like you to explain this peace initiative, and do you think that Iran will abide by this?
It's a peace initiative Iran proposed. Let me just take one more question, if there are any more questions. Yes, in the back.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, sir, for your speech. My question is, if the new proposal of Iran has been agreed by the 1+5 group, how can this reflect to the war in Yemen? As long as we know, as long as we all know that whenever there is a negotiation between Iran and 1+5 groups, there is a ceasefire in Yemen. How can this reflect to the war in Yemen if there is an agreement? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Dr. Mousavian, go ahead.
About your question on Europe, while Iran was disappointed from the US, during Rafsanjani, I was ambassador to Germany, and the Iranian policy was trying everything to have a comprehensive relation with the Europe. it was called Europe minus US. I mean, if we cannot have good relation with US, we can have good relation with Europe. We really did everything, frankly speaking. The problem since then is that Europeans are not independent from US policy, to be very frank. And they are followers of the US. Look at JCPOA. Trump withdrew from the deal. Europeans, they were only saying, we like JCPOA, but we followed every Trump sanctions, every. And Iranian economic relation, trade relation with Europe came to zero. Therefore, I have a problem with the independency of Europe in international equations and relations and regional relations. You mentioned about European citizens. Yes, we have had this problem since 1990s. But we have Iranian citizens also arrested and jailed in Europe. But the problem with Americans and you Europeans is that if an Iranian is arrested in Europe, it is legal, fair. If a European is arrested in Iran, it's hostage. And Iranians also, they believe this is Iranian citizens are arrested as a hostage in Europe. But this really is not the issue. This is not the issue. The issue is that for Iran and EU to define a good relation on whether this is economy or politics or security, regional, and if the EU can deliver commitments in the absence of US or not. If not, then Iran-US hostility is equal to Iran-Europe hostility. The second question was about Hormoz initiative. I explained all principles of Hormoz initiatives, but your question was whether Iran would abide or not. You tell me if you can give me one example after revolution, if Iran has agreed and then violated. One example. If they agree, they would abide. We agreed with George Bush on goodwill for goodwill. We delivered, they cheated. We agreed with the US on cooperation on Afghanistan, war on terror. We delivered, they cheated. We agreed on JCPOA. We delivered, they cheated. Therefore, if they agree on Hormoz initiative with all principles I mentioned, definitely Iran would remain committed. And I would be really happy to hear one example Iran has promised and then have cheated. In Yemen, I believe Iran and GCC, in the framework of Hormoz initiative, it has a lot of principles about how to manage the crisis, regional crisis, through cooperation within these principles in Hormoz initiative. If there is a unity, if there is a regional cooperation system, then everyone would benefit from stability, peace, whether this is in Syria or Yemen or Lebanon. But in the absence of peace and regional cooperation, if GCC or some of GCC countries, they are going to push the US to bring regime change and attack Iran or sanction Iran, then Iranians, they would have reactions like what you have seen. It is all options on the table.
Perfect. Dr. Mousavian, you've given us a lot of food for thought. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your opening remarks and keynote speech. Thank you all. We have a break now, and then we'll resume at 11 a.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.